Hello, I'm Richard Reitano, professor at Dutchess Community College and Vassar College, and president of the board of directors of the National Collegiate Conference Association. With me today, to my left, is Carolyn Smith. Carolyn Smith is currently a graduate student at New York University, and she is currently serving a kind of extended tour as an intern at the U.S. Mission to the United Nations. She has also served as an intern at the International United Nations University. And she has lots of experience with Model UNs, having participated in 7 of them as an undergraduate. We're also pleased to have with us today Ambassador Joseph Melrose, who has served for literally decades as the United States Ambassador in Africa. He also has served as acting U.S. Ambassador for Management and Reform at the United Nations, and he is currently Ambassador in Residence at Ursinus College. Hello, everyone. Let's start with a kind of basic question. What are some of the characteristics of a good and effective diplomat? Carolyn, why don't you start, and then we'll proceed to Ambassador Melrose.
Okay. I think the first thing I think of with a diplomat is definitely discretion. You're more likely to listen to what someone else has to say than to try to force your opinion or to broadcast it. Also, very friendly. It's really exaggerated, the kind of things you would see on TV with diplomats from what you would consider countries that are not very friendly with each other. When at the UN I see these people shake hands with each other every day, ask about each other's kids. Definitely very personable, very discreet and willing to listen, and just very patient also, not forcing an issue. I don't know, just very professional, I guess, but also personable.
Okay, in their behavior. Joe, you want to add something to that, please?
Yeah, I think Carolyn's right. I think most of the really skilled professional diplomats separate the policy issues that they're discussing from the personalities. And I might disagree with the position you're taking, but that doesn't mean I'm rude to you or in any way insult you. We expect mutual respect, cordiality, because after all, the United Nations seeks to achieve consensus. And you're not going to get consensus if you start ripping on your fellow colleague.
Well, as you know, some of the historically bad examples include Nikita Khrushchev, then the Soviet premier, banging his shoe, I guess at the podium in the Great Hall at a UN General Assembly meeting in 1960. And some even cite the current president of Iran, Ahmadinejad, and some of the remarks he made, and particularly the delivery that he presented at a recent 2012 General Assembly meeting. The question I have is, do you think that UN permanent representatives act that way, or should they act that way, the way Khrushchev acted and the way Ahmadinejad has been criticized for acting? And Carolyn, why don't you start?
Absolutely not. Those speeches from Khrushchev and from Ahmadinejad were during the general debate that week, where in 2 weeks, where heads of state and heads of government come to talk to the United Nations, and I think a lot of times those are done for show. Those are the ones that the TV cameras are at. Those are the ones where the presidents are able to make a statement, I think often more to their own people than to the international community. It is never like that, at least that I have ever seen. The permanent representatives, and certainly the people who work for them on these different specific issues, are never so dramatic, ever. Like Joe said, I think there's an understanding that, you don't create the policy. You're a civil servant for your government. You are representing your government's policy. It's not a personal issue. And I think that if we acted the way, Ahmadinejad and others act during the general debate, absolutely nothing would get done. And even the diplomats who represented at the time the USSR and even Iran, they are not as difficult as their heads of state are in these very public, showy general debates.
Joe?
I believe I've been through 6 general debates, and with the exception of Mr. Ahmadinejad and Mr. Chavez, there has been no outward display of anger or dispute. You get some speeches that are clearly more assertive than others. As Carolyn said, you're playing to a combination of the UN audience and your own national population, because they are going to be reported back home in some form, whether it's on TV or radio or whatever. When you get into the committee sessions, which are going on now with the first committee, second committee, through the sixth committee, I can recall only one instance where a representative sort of protested very vocally by banging his placard on the desk, which broke and flew in the air. But generally, you sit and listen to the other person, you make his point, you make your point, and you proceed to discuss it to try to reach a consensus on whatever the issue is. There are obviously some where consensus is not reached.
Now, neither one of you is implying that people can't feel, even diplomats, passionately about an issue. Obviously they can. So you're talking basically about the way they present themselves and present their nation's issues.
Yes.
Or policies, I should say, on those issues. Let me ask you, Carolyn, how would you describe really the behavior and actions of a good diplomat? You're a former model UNer. And what advice could you give to students, to delegates participating in model UNs in this particular regard?
I think the first thing I would say is do not try to model the way you act as a diplomat on a general debate speech. I understand there's always a big draw to represent a country like Iran or, say, North Korea, because they have very clear policies on things, and they're very interesting and very different from what you might deal with. But the way you see their head of state behave in the general debate is not the way that their diplomats behave on a day-to-day basis, especially in the different committees. So my first advice is never, ever take it to an extreme. Do not bang your shoe on the table. Of course, there is certain language that they are more likely to use. I would say definitely look at the speeches they have given in different committees. Those are always on record. You can either find them from their mission to the United Nations or the documents on the UN website. Look for that kind of language, and you use that kind of language. But also keep in mind that you are not Ahmadinejad or Hugo Chavez, even if you are representing the Islamic Republic of Iran or Venezuela. And to just act as professionally and nicely as possible. Even if you do not have good relations with another country, it's good to bear that in mind, but that doesn't mean that you don't say hello and introduce yourself or actually ask the person what their opinion is on an issue, because that's the way it actually works in a real General Assembly committee.
Question, and Joe, I think, can respond to this as well as a professor. How did Model UN assist you in understanding global issues and in your career choices? Your experience, again, with the 7 Model UNs that you participated in as an undergraduate.
Well, I think that Model UN really gave me an idea of what I would like to do at some point in my life, at least, is to work officially at the U.S. mission. As far as understanding global issues, it gave me first a very good understanding of the United Nations system, which is much more complicated than I had ever imagined, even though I considered myself fairly well informed when I was in high school. Most people think of the United Nations and they think of maybe the General Assembly during the general debates and the Security Council. The reality is there is such a broad spectrum of issues that they deal with. It's not just questions of, do you send a peacekeeping troop here? And the Model United Nations gave me a really good idea of the different issues, from development to human rights to gender issues, that the international community deals with on a daily basis that I would not have imagined get dealt with in a forum like the United Nations. Model UN really prepared me, especially for my internship so far, and giving me a knowledge of how those committees work, and also the types of issues that they deal with and what powers they have and where their limitations are that you might not expect. But I think that it gives students a really well-rounded view of how our country interacts with other countries, not necessarily just at the UN, but also on a bilateral level, using the UN as a forum for that.
Some of my students have described their experience with Model UN as life-changing. Do you think that that's a valid observation on their part?
Definitely. I remember the first Model UN I did, I was a freshman at Ursinus. I'd only been there for a few months, and we went to a Model UN in DC. And I was either fortunately or unfortunately representing our country in the Security Council. We were, I believe, Qatar at the time. And I think the life-changing thing about that was the idea, at least specifically at that Model UN, it sticks out for me, that everyone was there working towards a common goal. You're given an issue, and your job is to come up with an answer that all of your countries can accept. It wasn't about somebody winning or losing. It wasn't about whether you as an individual looked good in the committee. It was about whether it was something that you could all agree on. And that's a challenge.
Joe, you've got obviously many, many years of experience as a professional, but also for a number of years you've been a professor teaching young people. What's your sense about their understanding global issues by participating in Model UNs, and also how it affects what they ultimately decide, at least for the first phase of their young lives?
Well, I think when I was an undergraduate, I was interested in a career in diplomacy. I went to a Model UN as a student a few decades ago, when there were many fewer and smaller ones. As a professor, I think the big thing is it makes the textbook more alive. You can sit and read about what it does, but when you're trying to put yourself in that position, and albeit on a different level and without, the prospect of war or peace around the corner, but you get to experience some of the same thoughts and experiences, is good. I think the students that do it have a much greater appreciation. We in the United States particularly, although not only the United States, have a very superficial understanding of the UN and its complexity, as Carolyn said, and its many activities that go beyond the General Assembly and the Security Council. Doing Model UN helps certain skills like public speaking, like research, and perhaps above all trying to put yourself in the shoes of somebody else who has maybe a totally different life expectancy and life experience, and why do they see the policy that they're pursuing as in their best interest. A good diplomat, whether at the UN or at an embassy, needs to understand the context of the country he's working in and their population, and how that impacts their policy.
We're very lucky with our national model, United Nations, in that, for example, this past spring we had about 5,100 delegates from, I believe, 44 countries. What about the interaction, not only with other Americans, let's say, who are representing country X or country Y, but also with delegates coming from many other countries abroad? Mm-hmm. What's your sense? Was that valuable for you?
Definitely. It's a really fun way to make friends from a completely different country. And I mean, especially in today's world of Facebook, it's pretty easy to keep in contact with people that you met, 4 years ago at Model UN once. I think that especially helps with the personal relationships that you would even have at the UN, like we were talking about earlier. I think kids at the Model UN really just need to understand that those friendships that they're forming, it's okay to let that show in committee a little bit. You're not a completely different person when you walk through that door. But it does help with cross-cultural communication, I think, not just when you're representing two different countries, but when you are both from two different countries and you go out, to have dinner in between committee or something, and you learn more about students your own age and what they deal with wherever they're from, and they learn more about you.
Joe, just to follow up on the business of putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, could you comment on that in terms of, for example, my delegation this past spring represented Italy, and we've represented big and small countries, the United States and Cuba, China, you name it. What's your sense about how important that is in terms of learning, in terms of understanding the rest of the world, not just as an American, but as you said, putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, the way they perceive global issues, global problems?
Well, if you're going to make any progress in the world in this area, most other areas, you have to understand the views of the person you're dealing with, and why, the background, how they came to be, the historic situation that pertains to that particular country. And then if you understand that, you can better appreciate how you can deal with that. If you understand where another person is coming from in a negotiation, you're better able to negotiate. I mean, I certainly agree with Carolyn that it is extremely valuable to talk to people from overseas, from other member states, schools that are coming. In fact, I think that's probably, to me, one of the two most valuable parts of the conference, because you create understanding, create relationships, create bonds. I've had students that travel abroad and they go visit people they met in New York who show them around their school or whatever. I've had delegations that come and we've had them to Ursinus to show them around campus. We had the first Iraqi delegation that came spend a few days at Ursinus. It was a different experience for them. I think all those things add to global understanding, and especially in a world today where communication is instantaneous and probably there's too much of it.
Maybe a final question or two, and then I certainly welcome any comments that you both have. What advice can you give in terms of preparation to Model UN, prospective Model UN students as they begin the process of learning another nation's foreign policy? And beyond the prep, how should they act in New York? Let's say we're talking about our national Model UN, of course. Any advice there about how they should behave in terms of dealing with other delegates?
Sure. As far as prep goes, definitely start early. Because there's a lot more that you need to understand other than the basic statements that a country gives. Like Joe said, you really have to understand the situation that that country is in currently domestically, not just what their foreign policy is. Because Model UN requires not only that you go off of what your position paper says, but that you're able to think on your feet and to know immediately what your country would and would not agree to, what kind of resources they have, what they have been like, what they have done in the past, and what they would be likely to do in a different situation. So my advice is, first off, if you're looking for information about your position paper, to look on that country's missions website, their government website, and then for more background about the country, look at their domestic news forums, anything to learn about their domestic situation and to prepare early. About preparing for the conference, especially if you've never done this before, and this is the hardest part, is to prepare for the protocol of the actual Model UN. I think what we always did at Ursinus every year was we ran a sort of mini Model UN simulation for the class, just so they can practice things like how you properly ask to speak, what the speakers list is, the kind of language, what the difference between it is between, speech and, making a point of order or something like that. So definitely study the protocol for how you behave in committee. I think that is one of the bigger challenges when you're actually in committee, is knowing what's allowed and what's not. As far as behavior in New York, I think that in general Model UN students are very, very well behaved, but you're in a big city and a lot of people haven't been there before, just don't go crazy. Also, to have a little fun with it. You don't have to work all the way through till 4 a.m. to make sure that the resolution is exactly the way you want it. Like Joe said, I think one of the biggest points of a Model UN is to make friends. So to enjoy yourself, not to go crazy out on the town, but also to remember that, this is at the same time a professional atmosphere when you are in committee, and that you should be behaving with protocol, with decorum, even during informal sessions, because that is the way the real United Nations functions.
Joe, some comments about this?
A lot of the work of the United Nations is done outside of the United Nations. And as Carolyn is sort of saying, I got a lot of business done at receptions, dinners, lunches, over a cup of coffee, or whatever, where I could talk one-on-one or to a small group that either had similar views as I was representing or had opposing views. And that's critical. That's real life. In terms of preparation, going back to the way we started this little conversation, I would recommend that everybody read the statement made in the general debate by the head of state, head of government, or whoever, because that goes to the domestic issues as well as what's there. It also goes to where they see their priorities. Those two things are almost always in a general debate speech. Outside of that, I think it's working one-on-one. I've seen kids come back. At the U.S. mission, I've had a number of interns, other junior officers come in that have done a Model UN someplace. I've seen kids from Europe. I've seen kids from other countries that have come back and done it. And the thing with the UN is you'll frequently come back once or twice during your career, especially small countries. And I have it's been fun to come up and say, oh, I haven't seen you in 20 years. How you doing? And to sort of take up where you left off with your friendship in that capital or in Washington.
Any other comments or questions directed to each other before we close?
Geez, I don't know. Just for the kids to have fun with it, but also to know where to draw the line between professionalism and having fun, I think is the most overall advice I would give.
Sure.
I guess what I would say is what I think we say in closing ceremonies. It's not a winner-take-all competition. It's not the NCAA Final Four. It's learning to work together, appreciate each other, and if you're going to make progress in the world, it's going to be small steps by people working together, not one country doing everything. And when you talk about resolutions, there are very few resolutions that end up the same way as the first draft. There's a practice of compromise where somebody else's slightly different view is inserted. And the other thing to remember is in the UN resolutions, wording is extremely important. It is the nuance that goes with the word. Maybe some words will have stronger emotional connotations in different parts of the world than others. And it's understanding those subtleties that makes things work.
Carolyn Smith, Joseph Melrose, thank you both very much.